He rode into Apache land for revenge, but found the woman he could never forget. The morning air was cold and crisp as James Walker stood at the edge of the small village where he had grown up. The sun had not yet risen fully, and the first rays of light stretched across the dusty streets, casting long shadows that danced with the wind. Birds chirped softly in the distance, oblivious to the turmoil in James' heart. Today was the day he would ride into Apache land, a place few dared to go, driven by a fire that had been burning inside him for months. It was not a fire of hope, nor of dreams. It was a fire of vengeance, raw and unrelenting. James had not always been a man consumed by anger. Once he had been cheerful, full of laughter and easy smiles, the kind of man who could make friends wherever he went. But all that changed one fateful night when his younger brother, Michael, was killed in a violent dispute over land near the edge of Apache territory. James remembered the night vividly. The sharp crack of gunfire, the screams of panic, and the hollow feeling in his chest as he cradled his brother's lifeless body. The grief was unbearable, and in its place, anger and a sense of injustice took root. That night a promise was made silently, with no one to hear but himself. He would bring those responsible to justice. For weeks, James had been preparing. He had stocked his horse with supplies, dried meat, water skins, a sturdy blanket, and extra ammunition for his rifle. He had mapped out the territory he would cross, studying every ridge, river, and trail he could find in old maps and stories from travelers who had ventured near Apache lands. His neighbors had watched him, some with worry, others with fear. "You're walking into a trap, James," one of the older men had said, shaking his head. "Apache land is dangerous. Many have gone in, few have come back." But James did not respond. Words could not sway him. Nothing could. His mind was focused, almost rigid, on the path ahead. Mounting his horse, a strong chestnut mare named Willow, James felt a mixture of dread and determination. Willow snorted and stomped the ground, sensing the tension in her rider. James patted her neck gently, whispering words of encouragement, and together they started down the trail leading out of the village. The streets were quiet at this hour, only the sound of the horses' hooves against the packed dirt breaking the silence. Houses, modest and worn, began to fade behind him as the village disappeared from view. He glanced back briefly, seeing the smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. He felt a pang of sorrow, not for the village, not for himself, but for the brother he could never forget. As he moved further from familiar grounds, the landscape began to change. The soft, rolling hills of the village gave way to rocky terrain and scattered shrubs. The wind carried a different scent here, a mixture of dry earth and wild sage, unfamiliar and sharp. James felt the first twinge of fear, a subtle reminder that he was venturing into the unknown. But fear was not enough to deter him. He had long accepted that danger was part of the path he had chosen. Along the trail, he noticed signs of life that made him pause. Tracks in the dust, left by deer or perhaps by other travelers, reminded him that he was not alone. He kept his hand near the rifle slung across his back, eyes scanning the horizon constantly. The sun rose higher, painting the landscape with warm hues of orange and gold, but it brought no comfort. Every shadow could hide a threat, every bend in the trail could conceal danger. James understood that this journey was not just a physical challenge. It was a test of his patience, his judgment, and the strength of his will. By midday, he stopped near a small stream to rest and drink. He tethered Willow and let her drink first, watching the clear water ripple as it flowed over smooth stones. He knelt by the stream, cupping the water in his hands and bringing it to his lips. The cold water was refreshing, yet it reminded him of the fragility of life. His thoughts drifted to Michael, to the laughter they had shared as boys, to the long summer days running through fields that now seemed like distant memories. Pain tightened in his chest, a dull ache that never fully disappeared. It was this pain that fueled him, pushing him forward when every instinct screamed caution. While he ate a small meal of dried meat and bread, James's mind wandered to the people who had wronged his brother. He did not yet know their names or faces, only that they lived somewhere deep within Apache land. He had heard stories of outlaws, of men who would kill without hesitation and vanish like ghosts. Yet he was certain that justice could be achieved, that the balance could be restored if he stayed true to his path. It was a dangerous line he walked, but the thought of letting those responsible go unpunished was unbearable. Hours passed as he continued his journey. The trail became more rugged, winding through narrow canyons and over jagged rocks. Willow's sure-footed steps never faltered, but James could feel the strain of the journey in his own muscles. He had been riding since dawn, and fatigue began to settle in, a heavy reminder that he was human, not invincible. But he pushed forward, driven by the image of his brother's face and the promise he had made to himself that no wrong would go unrighted. As evening approached, the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land. James found a small clearing and decided to make camp for the night. He built a modest fire, its flames flickering and casting a warm glow on his tired face. The night air was cooler now, carrying the scent of wildflowers and distant pine. Sitting by the fire, James allowed himself a moment of reflection. He was not naive. He knew that Apache land was unforgiving and that the people there were skilled in survival and combat. But he also knew that he could not turn back. There was too much at stake and too many memories tied to his mission. As he lay down under the canopy of stars, the crackle of the fire the only sound breaking the silence, James felt a strange mix of emotions. There was fear, certainly, but there was also anticipation. The journey ahead was uncertain, and yet it was the only path he could take. He thought of Michael again, imagining his brother watching over him, urging him forward. And in the quiet of the night, as Willow rested beside him, James made another silent vow, not just for vengeance, but to survive, to endure, and to face whatever challenges awaited him with courage and resolve. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the night, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. Even in sleep, James's mind was alert, rehearsing the challenges he might face in the days to come. The journey was only beginning, and already it had tested his strength, his resolve, and his heart. He did not yet know that this path, which he had begun with thoughts of revenge, would lead him to experiences, people, and emotions he could never have imagined. But that was a story for another day. For now, all that mattered was taking the next step, one determined stride at a time, deeper into the land that held both danger and destiny. The morning sun rose slowly over the rugged landscape as James Walker tightened the straps on Willow's saddle and prepared for another day of riding. The terrain had changed since he left the safety of his village. Hills were steeper now, rocks sharper, and the trails narrower, twisting like the paths of a labyrinth. Every sound, the crunch of gravel beneath the horse's hooves, the distant call of a hawk, the whistle of the wind through the rocks, felt magnified in the stillness of the land. James had long since learned that silence could be as dangerous as noise in this wilderness. As he rode, he scanned the surroundings carefully. Tracks of deer and elk crossed his path, but more unsettling were the human signs, footprints, broken branches, and faint trails that hinted at recent passage. James's hand rested on the rifle slung across his back, ready for anything. He had entered Apache land, a place where strangers were rarely welcomed, and where one careless step could invite trouble. The thought did not frighten him, it sharpened his focus. Danger had become a companion on this journey, and he had grown used to the constant tension. By midday, the sun had climbed high in the sky, making the rocky terrain almost unbearable. James guided Willow toward a small canyon where he could rest in the shade. The mare dipped her head to drink from a clear, bubbling stream, and James watched her for a moment, feeling a quiet sense of companionship. Willow had been with him through long days and sleepless nights, carrying not just his body but the weight of his grief and anger. He patted her neck gently, whispering, "Good girl, we'll make it through another day." As he unpacked a small meal, James's thoughts drifted to the stories he had heard about Apache land. Travelers spoke of the Apache people as fierce and clever, skilled in hunting, survival, and defense of their territory. Some stories painted them as dangerous enemies, others told of their deep respect for nature, family, and community. James did not know which stories to believe. He had entered the land seeking revenge, yet he could not ignore the possibility that not every person he encountered would be an enemy. The thought was unsettling, but he pushed it aside. His mission was clear: find the men responsible for his brother's death. He had barely finished his meal when movement in the distance caught his eye. At first he thought it was a deer, but as the figures drew closer, he realized they were humans, travelers on horseback, making their way along a narrow ridge. James crouched slightly, keeping himself low, and watched carefully. There were 3 people, a man, a woman, and a younger boy. They looked weary from travel, their clothing worn and dusty. James's instincts told him to keep moving to avoid contact, but curiosity and caution made him slow his pace. The woman rode slightly ahead of the others, her posture confident, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she were used to reading the land. Her face was strong and calm, with a quiet determination that reminded James of the resilience he had seen in his own village. She noticed James almost immediately, raising a hand in cautious greeting. James hesitated, unsure whether to respond. There was a strange tension in the air. Neither of them wanted trouble, yet both were aware of the risks of encountering strangers in this land. The man riding beside the woman spoke in a low voice, and James could not hear the words clearly, but the tone was not threatening. The younger boy looked nervous, holding the reins tightly and glancing between the adults and James. After a moment of tense silence, James slowly rode forward, lowering his hand slightly from the rifle. "I mean no harm," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm just passing through." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Passing through can be dangerous here," she replied softly, yet with authority. "This land is not kind to strangers." Her words were measured, not accusing, but they carried a quiet warning. James nodded. "I know," he said. "I'm aware of the risks. I'm prepared." After a pause, she introduced herself. "I'm Elena. We're on our way to a village farther north. There's someone there who needs help." James listened carefully as she explained that they were carrying medicine and supplies to a remote community that had been struggling with illness. Her calm courage impressed him. Unlike him, who was driven by anger and vengeance, she traveled through the same dangers with purpose and compassion. Something about her presence felt grounding, a reminder that not every person in this land was an enemy. The travelers offered James a chance to join them for a short stretch, and after weighing the options, he agreed. Traveling with them could provide safety in numbers, and it might also give him insight into the land and its people. For the first time since leaving his village, James felt a small flicker of connection with others. It was a strange feeling, almost foreign but not unwelcome. As they rode together, Elena shared stories of the Apache people, describing their traditions, their respect for nature, and their resilience in the face of hardship. She spoke of their generosity to those who were in need and their courage when defending their families. James listened intently, feeling a subtle shift in his perspective. He had entered this land seeing only revenge and danger, but now he began to understand that life here was not black and white. It was full of challenges, yes, but also of strength, wisdom, and humanity. The journey was not easy. Narrow trails forced them to ride single file, and the rocky slopes tested Willow's surefootedness. Sudden gusts of wind howled through the canyon, and the temperature fluctuated sharply between scorching heat and chilling shadows. They encountered wild animals, a coyote here, a rabbit darting across the path there, but none were threatening. Every challenge reminded James of the harshness of the land, yet it also sharpened his skills and instincts. He began to notice patterns in the terrain, signs of wildlife and subtle cues in the wind and light. He was learning to read the land, to respect it, and to survive within it. As the day wore on, the group reached a narrow river crossing. The water was swift and cold, but necessary to continue the journey. James guided Willow carefully, testing each step before moving forward. Alina crossed confidently, helping the younger boy navigate the tricky path. James felt a growing respect for her resourcefulness and courage. She faced danger not with recklessness but with calm intelligence, a balance he admired deeply. After the river, they found a safe spot to rest for the night. The fire crackled gently as Alina prepared a modest meal. James helped, chopping wood and tending to Willow. Conversation flowed slowly, cautiously at first, but then with more ease. He shared fragments of his story, about his brother, about his purpose, and the sorrow that had driven him into this land. Alina listened with quiet understanding, offering no judgment, only a presence that was steady and reassuring. For the first time in months, James felt a small sense of relief from the weight of grief and anger he carried. That night, under the vast expanse of stars, James lay near the fire, reflecting on the day's journey. He had entered Apache land with a heart full of vengeance, ready to face danger at every turn. Instead, he had encountered not only peril but also courage, wisdom, and humanity. The presence of Alina and her companions had reminded him that life in this land was complex, and that survival required more than weapons and determination. It required understanding, patience, and respect. Even as he drifted into a fitful sleep, James knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. The land was still dangerous, and the people he sought for revenge were somewhere out there, hidden and watchful. But for the first time, he also knew that he was not entirely alone. There were allies, strangers who could become friends, and lessons in every moment of the journey. The land that had seemed threatening and unforgiving was beginning to reveal its secrets, and with them, glimpses of a path that was not just about revenge, but about growth, understanding, and perhaps even redemption. The next morning, James Walker awoke to the soft golden light of dawn filtering through the trees. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Willow, his loyal horse, nickered softly, stretching her legs as if sensing the long journey ahead. James ran his hand along her neck and whispered, "Another day, girl. We've got a long way to go." Despite the lingering ache in his muscles from the previous day, he felt a sense of determination and anticipation. The journey was far from over, and the challenges that lay ahead were uncertain, yet there was a strange calm in knowing he had allies for now. The group set out together, winding through narrow trails and dense forests that seemed to whisper with life. Alina rode beside him, her posture confident, her eyes scanning the landscape with careful attention. The younger boy followed closely behind, and the man from the previous day brought up the rear, vigilant and alert. James found himself studying Alina without realizing it. She moved through the land as if she belonged there, her instincts in perfect harmony with the environment. Every action, every decision, seemed guided by a quiet intelligence, an understanding that he could not help but admire. As they traveled, Alina began sharing stories of the Apache people, not as myths or legends, but as truths she had witnessed firsthand. She spoke of their deep respect for the land, of the careful balance they maintained between taking from nature and giving back. She told him of the importance of family, of community, and of teaching younger generations to survive with honor and dignity. James listened closely, feeling a strange mixture of fascination and humility. The people he had once thought of only as obstacles or enemies now appeared as human beings, with lives, struggles, and values just like his own. At one point, they reached a high ridge overlooking a wide valley below. The view was breathtaking, rolling hills, patches of forest, and a winding river that glimmered in the sunlight. James paused, taking it all in. The beauty of the land contrasted sharply with the anger and grief that had driven him here. For the first time, he felt a flicker of wonder and peace, emotions that he had not allowed himself to feel since the night his brother was killed. Alina noticed his gaze and smiled softly. "It's easy to forget sometimes," she said quietly. "That even in dangerous places, there is beauty worth seeing." James nodded, realizing that he had spent so long consumed by revenge that he had almost missed the world around him. The journey was not without danger. As the day progressed, they had to navigate treacherous terrain. Slippery rocks near the river, sudden steep inclines, and patches of loose gravel that threatened to send Willow tumbling. James relied not just on his strength and skill, but on careful observation and patience. He began to notice patterns, how the wind shifted, how the animals moved, and subtle signs in the land that indicated safe paths versus dangerous ones. With Alina's guidance, he learned to anticipate challenges before they became threats. Her knowledge was practical, grounded in experience, and it humbled him. Around midday, they stopped near a small grove of trees to rest. James unstrapped Willow's saddle and allowed her to graze, while Alina and the others unpacked a simple meal. They ate quietly, letting the sounds of nature fill the silence. It was a peaceful moment, one that allowed James to reflect on his journey so far. He thought about the anger that had propelled him into this land, the desire for revenge that had seemed all-consuming. But now, in the company of Alina and her group, he began to see a different path. Perhaps strength did not only lie in confrontation, but also in understanding, patience, and compassion. Alina, noticing his contemplative mood, spoke gently. "I know why you are here," she said. "But I also know that anger can weigh you down. It can blind you to the lessons this land has to teach." James looked at her, surprised by her insight. He had not spoken of his brother or his quest for vengeance in detail, yet she seemed to understand the burden he carried. He nodded slowly, feeling a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Could he truly let go of his anger, even for a moment, and see the world differently? Their conversation was interrupted by the sudden call of a hawk overhead, a sharp reminder of the vigilance the land demanded. They continued their journey, moving cautiously but steadily. As the hours passed, James began to notice subtle changes within himself. He found himself listening more, observing more, and reacting less impulsively. He helped Alina navigate tricky paths, but also allowed her guidance to shape his decisions. It was a delicate balance, one that felt strange at first, but increasingly natural as the day went on. In the late afternoon, they came across a small clearing where the sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating a cluster of wildflowers. James dismounted, letting Willow graze while he walked among the flowers, running his fingers over their delicate petals. The simple beauty of the moment struck him deeply. For so long, his life had been dominated by grief, anger, and the need for justice. Yet here, in this quiet place, he realized that life could hold moments of peace and wonder, even in the midst of danger. Alina approached him quietly, carrying a small water skin. "Drink," she said softly, handing it to him. James took it gratefully, and their fingers brushed lightly. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared experience and growing trust. For the first time in months, James felt a spark of connection that had nothing to do with revenge or anger. It was a subtle, powerful feeling, something that he could not ignore, even if he wanted to. As they prepared to continue, James noticed a series of footprints near the clearing, fresh tracks, made by humans. His instincts immediately went on alert, and he raised his rifle slightly, scanning the surrounding trees. Alina noticed the tension in his posture and placed a calming hand on his arm. "Breathe," she whispered. "Not every track is a threat. Sometimes it's just life passing through." James lowered his rifle, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. He realized how often his mind had been consumed by the expectation of danger, and how freeing it felt to trust someone else's judgment, even momentarily. That evening, they made camp near a quiet stream, the water reflecting the fading light of the sun. James tended to Willow while Alina prepared a modest dinner. The younger boy helped set up the campfire, and the man checked the surrounding area for signs of danger. As the fire crackled and the night grew cooler, James found himself sitting quietly, staring into the flames. He thought about the lessons he had learned that day, the value of patience, observation, and understanding. He thought about Alina, her courage, and the way she seemed to navigate the world with a quiet wisdom he had never encountered before. For the first time since leaving his village, James allowed himself to feel something other than anger. There was hope, fragile but present, and a growing awareness that life could hold more than the single-minded pursuit of revenge. The land that had seemed harsh and unforgiving was teaching him lessons he had not anticipated. Every challenge, every moment of beauty, every interaction with Alina and the others was shaping him in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. As he lay down that night under the canopy of stars, James reflected on the day's journey. The path he had chosen was still long and uncertain, and the people responsible for his brother's death were somewhere out there, hidden and watchful. Yet he felt a subtle shift within himself, a recognition that strength could come from understanding, courage from patience, and honor from choosing the right action rather than acting on impulse. He realized that his journey was no longer just about revenge. It was also about growth, about learning to see the world with clearer eyes, and about discovering the unexpected connections that made life worth living. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of the valley, the river, and the trails ahead. For the first time, James did not wake with thoughts only of anger. Instead, he woke with a sense of readiness, a feeling that he was not merely surviving, but beginning to understand the land and the people within it, and perhaps even himself. The next morning, James Walker awoke with a sense of quiet determination. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape of Apache land. He had been traveling for days with Alina and her companions, learning, observing, and reflecting on everything he had experienced. His anger had not vanished, nor had the grief over his brother's death, but now it was tempered with understanding, patience, and a new perspective that he had not anticipated. The journey that had begun with vengeance was evolving into something far more complex, a journey of self-discovery, courage, and unexpected connection. As they rode through the winding canyons and rocky trails, James felt a growing sense of anticipation. He knew that the men responsible for his brother's death were not far away. The thought of facing them brought a mix of fear and resolve. Yet he also knew that this confrontation would test not only his physical strength, but his judgment, his restraint, and the lessons he had learned along the way. The Apache land was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous, and every step forward required vigilance. By midday, the group reached a plateau overlooking a small settlement. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of livestock could be heard in the distance. James's heart quickened as he recognized the faces of men who had been implicated in the death of his brother. They moved confidently through their daily routines, unaware that James was observing from the edge of the plateau. The years of anger and grief threatened to surge back, demanding immediate action, but he took a deep breath, reminding himself of the lessons Alina had taught him. Patience, observation, and understanding were as crucial as courage. Alina noticed the change in his demeanor. "You found them," she said softly, her eyes following his gaze. "What will you do?" James did not respond immediately. He was torn between the desire for revenge and the awareness that acting impulsively could have consequences far beyond what he imagined. He remembered the words she had spoken days ago. Anger can weigh you down. It can blind you to the lessons this land has to teach. Her voice echoed in his mind, and he felt the first true conflict of his journey, the conflict between vengeance and wisdom. He spent hours watching them from a distance, learning their routines and noting the strengths and weaknesses of their position. James realized that he could strike at any moment, that he had the element of surprise on his side. Yet as he observed the settlement, he noticed small moments that challenged his assumptions. The men were not mindless killers. They laughed, worked, and interacted with their families. They had their own struggles, responsibilities, and fears. The realization did not erase his anger, but it began to reshape it, forcing him to see his enemies as human beings rather than mere targets. As night fell, James and Alina set up camp a short distance from the settlement. The fire crackled softly, illuminating their faces in the darkness. James sat quietly, staring into the flames, grappling with the internal battle that had consumed him for weeks. Alina sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring. "I know what you are feeling," she said gently. "This is not easy. You have every right to be angry, but sometimes choosing restraint takes more courage than acting on impulse." James nodded slowly, appreciating the wisdom in her words. It was a challenge unlike any he had facing not just his enemies, but his own instincts and emotions. The following morning, James decided to approach the settlement cautiously. He dismounted Willow and led her quietly along a hidden trail, observing the men's movements. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. The weight of the rifle on his back felt heavier than usual, not because of the physical burden, but because of the choice it represented. He could use it to end the lives of those responsible, or he could find another way to resolve the situation. The thought of mercy seemed almost impossible, yet the lessons of the journey, the patience, the understanding, and the trust he had begun to place in Alina urged him to consider it. As he moved closer, one of the men glanced toward the ridge. James froze, holding his breath. The man's eyes met his for a brief moment, and then he looked away, returning to his work. The tension in James's chest eased slightly, but he remained alert, every muscle ready for action. Alina, observing from a safe distance, gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. She trusted him to make the right decision, and that trust strengthened his resolve to act with wisdom rather than blind vengeance. Finally, the moment came when James had a clear view of the man who had been responsible for his brother's death. Time seemed to slow as he raised the rifle, aiming carefully. He could feel the familiar surge of anger, the desire for justice, the longing to make the world right through retribution. Yet as he looked closer, he saw the humanity in the man before him, his eyes, his posture, the way he interacted with his family. The image of his brother flashed in James's mind, and for the first time he questioned what true justice really meant. Was it taking a life in anger, or was it choosing a path that could lead to healing rather than more pain? James lowered the rifle slowly, a sense of calm washing over him. The decision was made, not out of weakness but out of strength. He realized that vengeance would not bring Michael back, nor would it bring him peace. Instead, it would perpetuate the cycle of violence that had already caused so much suffering. Taking a deep breath, he turned to Alina, who met his gaze with understanding. They would face the consequences of the confrontation together, not with weapons, but with courage and clarity. He stepped into the settlement cautiously, making his presence known without aggression. The men turned in surprise, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. James spoke calmly, explaining who he was and why he had come. His voice was firm, yet not filled with anger. He spoke of his brother, of the pain caused by their actions, and of the choice he had made not to escalate the conflict. The tension was palpable, but the sincerity in his words could not be denied. The men listened, some with remorse, others with surprise. There was no violence, no confrontation. Instead, a dialogue began, honest, difficult, and necessary. James realized that true courage was not in the act of killing, but in the ability to face one's enemies, speak the truth, and choose restraint. The settlement, once a symbol of danger and anger, became a place of reflection and understanding. James's presence challenged them to consider their own actions, just as he had been forced to consider his. After hours of conversation, the air in the settlement shifted. The tension eased, replaced by a cautious respect. James knew that he could leave knowing he had acted with integrity, not vengeance. The burden he had carried for so long began to lift, replaced by a sense of relief and accomplishment. He had faced the source of his anger, not with violence but with courage and wisdom. And in doing so, he discovered a strength within himself that he had never known before. As night fell, James and Alina left the settlement behind, riding into the quiet wilderness once more. The journey had changed him profoundly. The anger that had driven him into Apache land was no longer the sole force guiding his actions. Instead, he carried understanding, patience, and a renewed sense of purpose. The land that had seemed unforgiving and dangerous had taught him lessons far beyond survival. It had taught him about humanity, restraint, and the power of choice. By the time they made camp that night, James felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since the night his brother died. The fire crackled warmly, casting a soft glow on the surrounding trees. He tended to Willow, feeding her and brushing her coat, feeling the quiet comfort of routine and care. Alina prepared a modest meal, and the younger boy helped with the chores, their presence a reminder that even in the harshest places, connection and compassion could be found. As James lay beneath the stars that night, he reflected on the journey so far. He had entered Apache land seeking revenge, driven by grief and anger. He had faced danger, harsh landscapes, and the unknown. But in the process, he had discovered courage beyond the desire for vengeance, wisdom beyond the lessons of anger, and the quiet power of understanding and restraint. The confrontation he had feared had not ended in violence, but in clarity, a turning point that would shape the rest of his life. In the stillness of the night, James realized something profound. The journey was not over, but the path ahead was no longer defined by anger. He had learned that strength was not only in action but in choice. Courage was not only in confrontation but in restraint. And love, though still unspoken, was beginning to emerge quietly, nurtured by trust, shared experience, and the bonds formed through hardship. The Apache land that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving had revealed itself to be a teacher, guiding him toward understanding, compassion, and a new way of living. The morning light spilled over the horizon, painting the rugged terrain of Apache land in soft gold. James Walker woke to the quiet sounds of the wilderness, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, and the gentle breathing of Willow, his faithful horse. For the first time in many weeks, he felt a sense of calm and clarity. The confrontation he had feared was behind him, and the anger that had driven him into this land had been transformed. It no longer controlled him. Instead, it had been replaced by understanding, patience, and a newfound appreciation for the life that stretched out before him. As he rose and tended to Willow, James reflected on the days that had passed. He had ridden into Apache land seeking revenge for his brother, driven by grief and rage. He had faced danger, unknown terrain, and his own inner demons. But in the process, he had met Alina and her companions, learned to read the land, and discovered lessons about patience, courage, and the power of restraint. Most importantly, he had discovered the unexpected, the quiet, steady presence of Alina, whose wisdom, kindness, and courage had touched him deeply. The day began with a long ride toward a small Apache village where Alina had promised to deliver much-needed supplies. James followed closely behind her, observing how she moved with purpose and grace. Every step she took seemed confident yet careful, guided by experience and a deep respect for the land. He realized that her courage was not loud or aggressive. It was quiet, steadfast, and unwavering. It was the kind of courage that inspired trust and loyalty, and James found himself admiring her more with each passing moment. Along the way, they encountered the challenges that had become familiar companions on this journey: rocky trails, narrow passes, and the unpredictable movements of wildlife. But James was no longer merely surviving. He was fully present, learning from the land, anticipating its moods and adapting to its rhythms. He had become stronger, not just in body, but in mind and heart. The lessons of patience, observation, and understanding that Alina had taught him had taken root, guiding him with a wisdom he had never known before. As afternoon approached, they reached the village. The people greeted them warmly, grateful for the supplies and medicine that Alina had brought. Children ran toward them with curious eyes, and elders nodded respectfully. James was struck by the sense of community, the deep bonds of care and responsibility that connected everyone. It was a stark contrast to the isolation he had felt during the early days of his journey, when grief and anger had consumed him. Now he could see that life was richer, more meaningful when shared with others. While Alina attended to the villagers, James helped with the distribution of supplies. He carried baskets of food, water, and medicine, moving among the people with a quiet sense of purpose. He felt a growing satisfaction in helping, in contributing to something larger than himself. For so long, his actions had been driven by anger and a desire for vengeance. But now, he found joy in generosity, in kindness, and in the simple act of supporting others. Each smile he received, each word of gratitude, reminded him that life could be beautiful, even in the midst of hardship. As the day turned to evening, James and Alina set up a small camp just outside the village. The fire crackled, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and earth. Willow grazed nearby, content and calm. James found a quiet moment to reflect, sitting beside Alina as she prepared a modest meal. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with understanding and unspoken connection. James realized that his feelings for her had grown deeper than he had anticipated. It was more than admiration. It was respect, trust, and a quiet, persistent affection that had been nurtured through shared trials and experiences. Alina glanced at him, sensing his thoughts. "You've changed," she said softly. "This journey, it has taught you a lot, hasn't it?" James nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. "I've learned more than I ever expected," he replied. "Not just about the land or about survival, but about myself. About what really matters." Alina's eyes met his, and in that moment there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the bond that had formed, the trust that had been built, and the possibility of something more. Night fell and the stars appeared, shining brightly in the clear sky. James lay near the fire, listening to the gentle sounds of the village and the distant wind through the trees. His mind wandered to the journey that had brought him here, the anger that had driven him, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned. He thought of his brother, of the grief that had once consumed him, and of the choice he had made not to let revenge define his life. There was still sadness, yes, but it was tempered with peace, understanding, and a sense of purpose that he had never known before. Over the next several days, James and Alina continued their journey, helping the village and learning more about the Apache people. James found himself fascinated by their traditions, their deep respect for nature, and the strength of their community. He realized that the people he had once viewed only as part of the conflict were human, just like him, with hopes, fears, and dreams. Every interaction, Every act of kindness and every story shared added layers to his understanding, helping him see the world in a way he had never imagined. As the days passed, the bond between James and Alina grew stronger. They shared moments of laughter, quiet reflection, and mutual support. James found himself looking forward to her presence, valuing her insight and the calm strength she brought to every situation. He realized that love could be quiet and patient, nurtured through trust, shared experience, and mutual respect. The harshness of the land and the challenges of the journey had brought them together, creating a connection that felt genuine, enduring, and transformative. Eventually, James knew it was time to leave the village and continue his journey toward a new life. He had found what he had not expected: peace, understanding, and a bond with someone who had touched his heart deeply. As he prepared to ride, Alina joined him, their hands brushing as they mounted their horses. There was a sense of unspoken agreement between them, a promise of shared purpose and the possibility of a future together. The land that had once seemed unforgiving now felt like a place of hope, connection, and new beginnings. The ride back through the trails was different from the journey he had undertaken alone. James noticed the beauty of the land in a way he had never before. The way sunlight danced on the rocks, the gentle flow of rivers, and the vibrant life of the forests. He felt gratitude for the lessons the land had taught him, for the experiences that had shaped him, and for the presence of Alina by his side. Every step, every mile, reinforced the understanding that life was not just about vengeance or anger, but about courage, compassion, and the choices that defined who we truly are. As they reached the outskirts of the village James had left weeks ago, he paused, looking back at the land that had transformed him. The mountains, the canyons, and the trails were no longer symbols of danger and anger. They were reminders of growth, resilience, and the unexpected gifts of the journey. He turned to Alina, a sense of gratitude and affection shining in his eyes. "I never expected this," he said softly. "I came here for revenge, but I found something far more important." Alina smiled, her hand resting briefly on his. "Sometimes the path we think we must take leads us exactly where we need to be," she replied. James Walker's journey through Apache land had begun with grief and anger, driven by the desire for revenge. It had tested his strength, courage, and resolve in ways he could never have anticipated. But through the challenges, he had learned the value of patience, understanding, and restraint. He had discovered the humanity in others, the beauty of the land, and the quiet power of love and connection. What had started as a journey for vengeance had transformed into a journey of growth, healing, and hope. As night fell on their final camp, James and Alina sat together beneath a sky filled with stars, listening to the gentle sounds of nature and the distant murmur of the village. There was peace in the air, a sense of completion and new beginnings. James knew that life would continue to present challenges, but he also knew that he was no longer defined by anger or grief. He had found purpose, connection, and the beginnings of love, gifts far more enduring than revenge could ever provide. With Willow resting nearby, the two of them looked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever the future might hold. James's heart was lighter than it had been in years, filled with gratitude, understanding, and hope. The Apache land, once a place of danger and fear, had become a teacher, a guide, and a place of transformation. And as he held Alina's hand and watched the stars shine above, James realized that the journey was not over. But for the first time, he felt ready to meet it with courage, wisdom, and an open heart.